So if Labour wins the election, are you going to be spending £28 billion a year by the end of the Parliament on your green commitments?
Well, the ambition is to ramp up to £28 billion. The challenge we've got with this and with all of our other priorities and the policies that we're costing up and thinking about for our manifesto is the state of the public finances, the state of the economy, which is so much worse than I think any incoming government would inherit for generations, a far bigger challenge than we had in 1997. And that's why, across the board, we're having to make some difficult choices because we need to make sure that the manifesto we set is fully costed, fully funded, with promises we can keep.
So are you going to be spending £28 billion a year on your green plans by the end of the Parliament?
Well, that's the ambition, because...
And what does that mean?
Well, because it means...
I can have an ambition to be Taylor Swift or, to be in the England cricket team. Doesn't mean it's going to happen.
Well, it's never too late, Sophie, but there's a serious point
I think it is too late, I'll be honest.
There's a serious point. Shake it off. There's a serious point here, which is the ambition is to get to clean power by 2030. And the reason we've set that as a mission for the next Labour government...
It's a lovely
No, but hang on, just hear me out here, because this is ultimately about Britain's national interests and what is value for money. And we could continue to do the same short-term sticking plaster politics of the Conservatives, which have left us with higher bills, energy insecurity, prone to what's happening with global markets, and missing out on the race for green jobs in clean power. Or we can have the ambition, as we have, to say, actually, if we accelerate our progress to get more of those clean, green jobs in our country, we can reindustrialise parts of the country that have suffered, cut bills and give Britain its energy security back.
When Chris Bryant was asked this question this morning by Kay Burley, he said, we are doing it, it will be £28 billion. You're not saying that, are you?
No, I'm saying what Keir said and what the rest of the team has said.
Not what Chris Bryant
which is
said.
Ramping up to £28 billion. And what I think we've
by the end of the Parliament?
What we've acknowledged is that since Rachel Reeves first made that speech to Labour conference, a hell of a lot has changed in the economy, not least because of the catastrophic misjudgments made by Liz Truss with that disastrous mini-budget.
OK, so if Ed Miliband's over here, loves the £28 billion green policy, Rachel Reeves is like, oh, I'm worried about the finances. Where are you in this scale?
Well, hang on a minute. Before we all sort of start moaning about, the mean-spirited shadow chancellor, we're united on this.
So you're more like Rachel Reeves,
We
then?
all know, we are all, as a shadow cabinet, united on this, because we know that the catastrophic mismanagement of the public finances has been a disaster for family finances through rising rents, rising mortgages, rising bills. And so underpinning all of our priorities and all of our policies has got to be that fiscal discipline, the fiscal rules that Rachel Reeves has set out, and we are all signed up on. So I'm not going to sort of join in this idea. I mean, I joke sometimes about Rachel Reeves, and she is tougher with us in private than even she is in public. That's her job as the Shadow Chancellor. But it's also why people trust her as an effective steward of the public finances, why when they compare her to Jeremy Hunt and the chancellors that have been before Jeremy Hunt as Chancellors of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves is far more qualified. She's a former economist at the Bank of England.
And she says you can't do £28 billion a year.
And she knows, as we all know, that if you don't have fiscal discipline, you can't deliver your promises, but also you can't improve the cost of living and the family finances too. And that's why it's got to underpin everything else.
You're Shadow Health Secretary. You're talking about not having enough doctors, not enough dentists. But you'd quite like £28 billion a year to spend on the NHS?
Well, I'd never say no, but also there's a serious point here as well, Sophie, in that when I've spoken to Rachel about the pressures on the NHS, I've had to do that, as everyone else has, against that backdrop of bleak public finances. I've also done it with a recognition, by the way, that we need to think more carefully about how the NHS spends the money it already has. Because people can't get a GP appointment or a dentist appointment, a GP appointment, for example, costs 40 quid, they end up in A&E, which costs £400. So it's worse for patients and worse for the taxpayer, which is why, as part of the reform agenda, I want to shift the focus of and the centre of gravity of the NHS out of hospital into the community, because it's better for patients and better value for taxpayers.
You want to reform dentist contracts in particular. You've been out visiting people in Bristol today who have these long waits to see an NHS dentist. What exactly do you want to do?
Well, it's not always about money in NHS reform, and I've been pretty blunt about making that case. In dentistry, though, a lot of it is about money, and the reason why so many have handed back their contracts is because it just doesn't pay. And do you know what really sticks in the craw is that last year we had a £400 million underspend in the NHS dentistry budget, despite the fact there are people literally queuing around the block in Bristol, where I was this morning, talking to people and listening to their heartbreaking stories about the damage this has done. And what the Health Secretary did today was take a whole range of measures from Labour's emergency dentistry plan, so I'm not going to knock her for that, but she didn't adopt the argument we were making about reform of the contracts. And actually what she said is, I'll do that in 2025. Well, firstly, big assumption you're going to be in government, Victoria Atkins. But secondly, your party promised this in 2010. Why would people believe that a broken promise in 2010, 15, 17 and 19 would now be delivered with an unprecedented fifth term of Conservative government? Who are they trying to kid?
So on your own, because I'm keen to talk about, take you seriously, you're the guy who wants to be Health Secretary after the election. What do you want to do to NHS dentist contracts? Are you effectively saying that right now, too many dentists are going through university, perhaps getting subsidised training, and then going to earn money in the private sector? Should they be effectively encouraged, forced to work longer in the NHS?
Well, to be fair to the government, we've made that argument. To be fair to the government, that they've adopted that today, and we want them to get the consultation on that done as quickly as possible, because I think that would be a sensible change. But we do have to address the funding of the contract as well, and that's why I've said...
So pay more money for NHS treatments.
And look at the underspends that we've had year after year after year in dentistry, which have then been sucked off and into secondary care, which means that patients don't get the support and the care they need, the treatment they need up front in the community, in dentistry practices. So they end up in hospital, worse for them and more expensive for the taxpayer. And I've said, look, this is so urgent that week one of a Labour government, the Monday after the general election, I'm going to get the British Dental Association into the Department of Health, if I'm the Secretary of State and we've won the election, say, OK, let's agree now the process for contract negotiation, let's get the ball rolling immediately, because it's that urgent. This lot have been in for 14 years, and having broken their manifesto commitment over 4 general elections now, they're expecting the country to say, do you know what? Well, let's have the triumph of hope over bitter experience and give the Tories an unprecedented fifth term. That is a disaster. That would be the risk the country can't afford, a fifth term of Conservative government that would run NHS dentistry down further and continue with the mismanaged decline of the NHS. And if we're not careful, what we see in dentistry now, which is people forced to go private and the NHS is a poor service for poor people, that's the future for the NHS. That's the future we can't risk with the Tories.
Now, I don't want to spend too long on this because, in some ways, I think the whole thing is pretty unedifying. But you'll know what I'm talking about. The moment at Prime Minister's Questions today, where Rishi Sunak made a comment about Keir Starmer's record on transgenderism in front of the parents of Brianna Guy, who was transgender. She was, of course, killed. Now, Kemi Badenoch's come back to say, the Culture Secretary, every murder is a tragedy. None should be trivialised by political point scoring. As a mother, I can imagine the trauma that Esther Guy has endured. It was shameful of Starmer to link his own inability to be clear on the matter of sex and gender directly to her grief, and then saying that his behaviour today shows Labour are happy to weaponise this issue when it suits them.
I think I'd say 2 things. Firstly, Kemi Badenoch should listen to decent Conservative MPs, like Deanna Davison, who's spoken out this afternoon, who I think recognise that what the Prime Minister was guilty of this afternoon was of using a minority in our country, a small minority, which is trans people, who are at the wrong end of all of the statistics on hate crime, as a political punchline. And I think that was particularly irresponsive. It was obviously insensitive, given that Esther Guy was in the chamber today. But even if she hadn't been, it's still irresponsible. And particularly in an election year, I think we as politicians have a responsibility to conduct our debate and our conversations in a more respectful way on this and other issues. And that's what I think Rishi Sunak didn't do today. The thing I also think the Conservative Party has been guilty of, and where I think Kemi's got some brass neck, frankly, they have deliberately stoked culture wars in the hope that every minute of airtime we spend talking about this is a minute of airtime we're not talking about the cost of living crisis or the crisis in the NHS or all of the other issues the Conservatives have failed on. And if Rishi Sunak thinks he's going to win the election because people will be distracted by culture wars and will therefore forget the Conservatives' appalling record, I think he's in for a real shock. But we're
There's-
not going to engage in this culture war.
OK.
And I see it as our responsibility to put the fire out the Tories have started.
Just finally, while we have you, the King this week diagnosed with cancer. That was made public by Buckingham Palace. And I guess, you know, that's something that you will understand more than most.
Yeah, I've been there myself with kidney cancer. And a couple of things went through my mind the other day beyond obvious shock and sympathy for what the King's going through, which is a cancer diagnosis comes as a really awful shock, whoever you are. It doesn't matter if you are one of the most famous and wealthy people in the country or whether you are one of the poorest people in the country. And the second thing is, thinking about my own experience, I think it was almost harder for my family than it was for me. My prognosis was good. I always knew what was happening to me. And I think for my family, there was that sense of helplessness that, again, despite being the royal family, they're still a family. They're still people with feelings like the rest of us. And I've been a bit uncomfortable, actually, in the days that followed the announcement, of some of the commentary and people saying, well, I think we should know what sort of cancer it is. Or look, here's the King coming and going from the palace. Or look, the first images emerge. And I think he might be the King, but he's a human being with a family. And I think they deserve a bit more privacy, actually. And he needs space to go through that treatment. His family needs space to support him. I know they're still going to be doing their public duties and doing their duty. That's what the royal family does. But we shouldn't forget that there are human beings at the centre of this. And I'm sure every family who's been touched by cancer, bearing in mind 1 in 2 of us will have had it, and everyone knows someone they love who's been affected by cancer. Let's keep that in mind when we think about the royal family, just as we would any other family.
Wes Streeting, thank you.
Thanks a lot.